Hey guys, and welcome to the second installment of my Spotlight on series. And this time we are talking about The Other series by Anne Bishop. Usually it is right here. And this is actually a series that has the 5 main books. That was the original series, and then 2 companion novels afterwards. I'm going to be focusing on the first 5. And it starts with Written in Red. And then book 2 is Murder of Crows. Book 3 is Vision in Silver. Book 4 is Marked in Flesh. And then book 5 is Etched in Bone. So this is an urban fantasy series that follows the main character of Meg Corbin. And she is on the run from, she's a blood prophet, and which means that like if you cut her skin and ask a question, she will see visions of the future that answer your question. And she is on the run from people who would exploit her, because obviously that is a very excellent gift to have and to use. And she stumbles into what is called the courtyard. The courtyard is not controlled by humans. It is controlled by a species called the Terra Indigene. And it essentially acts as a buffer zone between the humans and the people the Terra Indigene that are more wild. And so now the Terra Indigene have a choice to make. Are they going to not help Meg, send her back to the humans, allow, human affairs to stay in human control, or are they going to protect her and potentially start a conflict with the humans? That is the plot of the first book, and the rest of the series follows from the choices that were made in that first book. So let's dive right in and talk about world building. So for you to understand how interesting the world building is for this series, I'm going to talk a little bit about urban fantasy in general. So urban fantasy in general follows werewolves, vampires, and or fae in essentially like an alternative modern times, usually obviously in a city kind of setting. That's where the urban part comes in. And it's very interesting. Most series look at it and say these other species are the apex predator. They can easily take out a human, not even a problem, but they're not the dominant species. In the sense of, if you, like us humans, have the tools to kill these people, it's hard, but we can do it, especially because playing the numbers, we have so many more people than they do. We can throw 50 people at a werewolf, and eventually that werewolf is likely to die, and it's going to make a dent in their population, but 50 people doesn't make a huge dent in our population. Additionally, often in these kinds of books, the vampires, werewolves, and or fae are often don't want to actually kill all the humans because they're reliant upon them either as a food source or to propagate their own species. So vampires, for example, need humans so that they can create more vampires. And that's generally what this is. So again, we're back to apex predator, but not the dominant species. And Bishop looked at this and said, what if there's a species, the Terra Indigene, that was here first, and they are the apex predator and the dominant species, and the humans are just this upstart species that they have to kind of deal with? But they don't need us for food, because although they like eating us, they don't, that's not the only food source they have. They don't need us to propagate their own species, and they have numbers on their side as well. So how would that world look? And that is what this entire world is built off, is that idea that we're not the dominant species. And so she took that idea and built this entire world out of it. And I have to hand it to her. She did not just take this interesting idea and then only go surface level on it and just have this facade of an interesting world. She actually created an in-depth, interesting world. And I love it so much. World building is one of the things that I love the most, and she did such a good job. She took an interesting idea, she ran with it, and she gave us so much. And it is so good. And this concept is so different from most urban fantasies out there that it was just really, really interesting to read. It's a different concept done very, very well. So I love the world building. Um, so let's talk about plot a little bit. I can't talk too much about the plot of the later books because, again, it's a series and they're all the books are interconnected. But we have this first book where they're deciding whether they're going to get involved, potentially the Terra Indigene are going to potentially start a conflict with the humans over protecting this one human that the humans are supposed to be protecting and don't. And so the events of the book make sense. And then the second book, the plot of the second book follows logically from what happened in the first book. You're just like, oh yeah, of course that would happen. That totally makes sense. And then the events of the first two books set up the plot for the third and fourth book. But the thing is, like, sometimes when authors do that, you can tell that they're kind of forcing events into places that they don't quite fit because they clearly have an ending in mind that we're working towards. Where you're like, okay, yeah, it logically follows, but it doesn't feel quite right. And you're clearly just trying to get to the end. Whereas with this series, it feels very logical. It feels very natural. Like, of course, this is where we're building. This completely makes sense. And yes, you've characterized humans correctly. And like, it makes so much sense. I find it very commendable. I know she had to have been working towards an end point in her mind, but it feels like we just naturally got there. It doesn't feel like she forced it that way. The only quibble I have about the plot is that the big climax kind of point feels like we hit it in the middle of book 4. Like the event that we're kind of setting up and building to in the first 4 books happens in the middle of book 4. And then the 5th book really deals with the aftermath of it. And it makes sense. And again, natural progression, I completely understand it, but it did feel a little bit like a letdown because that's just not usually how we do it, right? If we have a 5-book series, we're usually leading up to a plot point that happens in like the 5th book, usually beginning middle of the 5th book, and then we take the rest of the book to kind of deal with the aftermath. And that's not really what we did. And so that 5th book felt a little, I don't know how to describe it. It felt a little, it didn't feel tacked on. Again, like it felt like a very natural progression, but it's just not usually how things are plotted out. So it felt a little weird. Other than that, though, again, plot was great. And the pacing of it was actually really, really good as well. Which leads into a little bit of structure and how the actual writing style. I love her writing style. It is not flowery. It's not even lyrical, but it doesn't go so far as to be utilitarian. It's just nice, easy to read kind of writing. And she does a really good job of it. The pacing is fantastic. She has a really, really good balance of world building versus character development versus action versus dialogue versus like she's blending all of this really, really well. Occasionally, we do run into parts that are a little bit slower, but that's mostly because our main character needs to learn something or make a few discoveries before we can kind of progress back on to the plot. And like, but it's when it does slow down like that, it's not like 100-page slowdown, you guys. It's like 15. And so it's like 15 to 20 pages where you're just like, this is a little bit slower than normal, but it's not even super slow, and it's completely understandable why. And so I just kind of accept it. I think it's fine. I don't think that it hindered my enjoyment of this series at all. And then characters and character development. So I think that the author actually set herself up for a really hard character to write with Meg Corbin. Blood Prophets are described as being very innocent, very sweet, essentially a child's soul in a human woman's body. And she could have very easily been written in a way where she felt kind of dumb instead of ignorant, or even getting into insipid. And I thought that Anne Bishop walked that line very, very well. I love Meg as a character. She is sweet. She is innocent in ways that you completely understand. She has been sheltered from this world. She has been taken care of her whole life. And now she's been thrust into this great big world that doesn't care, that is telling her that you're an adult. Freaking act like it. Like, take care of yourself. And she learns and she grows and she does it in a way where it makes sense. And yeah, occasionally I'm yelling at her because I'm like, don't do that. That doesn't, oh, come on. Like, don't make that choice. That's such a bad choice. But it's an understandable choice. And it's the kind of thing where you would be yelling that at a character who's a kid or a teenager, where you understand why they're making that choice. And like, it's part of their growth. You just wish that it didn't have to be, right? You wish that they could kind of figure it out in any other way. But you're not really mad at them because it is such an understandable choice. So, like I said, I really love Meg as a character. She is one of the few characters that I really honestly relate to. I don't relate to many characters, but I do with her, and I really like her. The other characters are Simon is a wolf, and he is the main person that we deal with when we're talking about the Terra Indigene. And his development and his growth is also very interesting to watch, and again, very realistic, very well done. The only other main character where we actually see their perspective is a police officer by the name of Monty. And I didn't think he was as well developed. I feel like he's more a well-developed secondary character than like a primary character. But then we have there's a huge cast of characters in these books that for the most part are very distinct from each other, which is amazing, right? Like, the only people who get a little fuzzy and are very similar to each other are the police officers. There's like a total of like 6 police officers, and 2 of them are very distinct, and then like 3 of them kind of you maybe get a little fuzzy around remembering who is who. But you know, they're very they're not the main people in this book, and none of their stuff is like the primary storyline, so it works out okay. Everybody else has distinct personalities and distinct perspectives, and I think it was done, the characterization in general was done very well. The one thing that I think that another thing, I guess I should say, that I think she did really, really well on, the author, is when events happen, we see the human reaction and we see the Terra Indigena reaction, and we get to see how they are different. The reactions are very logical, they very much make sense, and they serve to show the divide between these 2 species and why they're having conflict in the first place. And it's very good as a plot device, and it's very good so that we understand these characters as they are. And I just think it's very, very well done. So in general, I think the characters are very good. So my biggest problem with this series is the lack of diversity. And it is hardcore lack of diversity. Monty is Black and his family is Black. And that is the only diversity we have out of a huge cast of characters. There are no other races that we know of, race and ethnicities that we know of. Even with Monty, he's Black, and it has no bearing on anything. Like, nothing is different. Except you may recognize a little bit of how he was raised, but that's about it. And it has no bearing on anything, like, now that he's an adult, really. There's nobody in the queer family, either for sexuality or gender. There's nobody who is disabled, either physically or mentally. There's like no neurodiversity, and it's like, the only person who could be called neurodiverse is actually Meg. And she is, and it's not because of anything that we recognize as neurodiverse. It's like a fantasy thing, right? She's a blood prophet. And that's it. That's all the diversity. And so I do think that that is a huge, huge problem, because if you're gonna, you should have diversity, and it should have an effect on the story. And it could have been so easy to include some, and she just didn't. She really, really just didn't. Oh, there was one more, like, slightly neurodiverse character, Skippy. Again, like, they look on him with pity, and I just didn't feel, anyway, lack of diversity. So, and there are a couple content warnings I should give you. One is for violence. For the most part, the violence is graphic, but generally not described. The few times that it is described over the course of the series, it is to progress the plot further, but it is gory, y'all. Like, if you're a person who pictures this stuff, you might be kind of grossed out. Just a heads up. The other really big content warning is for rape, sexual violence. Now, there are no rape scenes where it's like explicit blow by blow. We don't see it, but it's also, just because we don't see it happen, we know what is happening. It is very, very clear that these women are getting raped, and there's like, we can't brush it aside. That is what is happening. And we also see that Meg herself was raped. Again, it's not explicit. She does not use those terms, but she has PTSD. She reacts very particularly to certain things. She clearly has triggers, right? Like, how her prophecy works, she doesn't remember what happened in her brain, but her body does. And so she reacts very particularly to certain things. She has triggers, and it happens. And urban fantasy has a really horrid relationship with rape and sexual assault and consent. It is not a good track record. I think that when we compare the other series to other urban fantasy series, the others does a very, very good job compared to other urban fantasies. However, if you look at like reality as well as maybe some other genres, it's just okay. And so, just keep that in mind, that there is very clearly rape. Meg is very clearly has PTSD. It's not, she doesn't necessarily understand it, and she doesn't necessarily know how to deal with it. But those are things that you should be aware do crop up in these books. But honestly, even with that fifth book being a little bit of a weird thing in the grand scheme of the plot, even with the lack of diversity, which I think is the biggest problem, and even with the rape and PTSD and, the aftermath of the rapes that she has clearly endured, not being as good as I would have wanted it to be, I still think that this is an amazing series. It is one of my top favorite series. This is the series that I will read as a comfort read. When I want something, because I just need something really that I know is going to be really, really good, this is the series that I pick up. So there you go. If you've read this book, please let me know. Where's my urban fantasy people at, And if you haven't, are you intrigued? I really hope some of you pick it up, because I do think it is so worthwhile. Even just for seeing how Anne Bishop turned the world building of urban fantasy a little bit on edge and did something very, very different with it. Let me know. Come talk to me about this series. It's just so good. But I think that's all I've got for you guys. And so until next time, I hope you guys have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.